It's simply a fact that we kind of know how we're going to unfold today because of the way in which yesterday went. Now, there are exceptions to that. Sometimes there's a major event yesterday that colors what we do today, but normally our lives follow a pattern that does not help us to entertain that which is new or different. And so it's not unusual that when Jesus appeared to those disciples and those followers who were gathered in this room after the crucifixion and after the news of the resurrection had been shared with a large number of people, that Jesus should have spoken about opening one's mind to consider that which is beyond the pale of human experience. We know that even as we read the account that comes to us through the Gospels of the life, death, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ, that it is not something we have yet encountered. And so to say to those who are gathered in that room, make an open mind. Consider that which you have not at this point thought about. I can understand that because they have lost a very close friend. The crucifixion, the word of the resurrection. There was an account that somebody has taken the body of Jesus away from the tomb. So there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the events that have transpired in just a few short days. And they are gathered here out of grief, not out of anticipation. They're basically trying to figure out what do they do from this moment on. For the patterns of their life had been so altered and changed by the life and ministry of Jesus that it was unthinkable that they would just simply have to let go of that and go back to what had been before. What do we do now? Was the question upon the hearts of those who were gathered there. What do we do now? We cannot imagine what tomorrow will be like. The concerns of this day are so great and so overwhelming that we cannot even begin to think about what tomorrow might bring. We're caught in the throes of our grief, our uncertainty. We're just simply overwhelmed by the events that have taken place in such a short period of time. I know that sometimes we also feel that way. There are times when the events of the first few days prior to a moment just simply leaves us feeling like we can't move. We just are dead in our tracks, if you will. I think that's exactly what was being felt by those who were gathered in this room when Jesus appeared. They weren't ready for that. They were startled. They were surprised. They were a little bit overwhelmed, even though they had heard from some, like Mary and Martha and Peter and John, that they had seen Jesus after the crucifixion. They had actually spoken with him and met with him. But somehow that doesn't seem to register when you're simply overwhelmed by the circumstances surrounding the event. And so, when Jesus appeared to them in that room, it was a sudden moment. It was a startling moment. It was beyond the pale of their experience, if you will. It's no wonder that the Gospel in Luke says that they needed to have their minds opened. They needed to consider that which they had not at this point anticipated. You know, life sometimes does throw us those moments, and it's difficult to make the transition from what was to what now may be. And yet, that's what the gospel writer wanted us to do. Wanted us to understand that when God's plan was unfolding, it was a plan that had to do with how we experience life and how we come to trust in life everlasting. And that is exactly what Jesus was trying to say. Now, in this account, of course, there is a conversation about the need for repentance. There is an account about the fact that sin does crowd in upon us and keeps us from seeing and keeps us from having a mind which is open to the possibilities that Jesus lays before us. Sin is a symbol of our brokenness in this world. And all of us have experienced that. We have been alienated from each other, and we have experienced alienation from God. Fortunately for us, God doesn't say, save yourselves. God isn't saying to us, you got to do this in order to be acceptable to me. You are acceptable to God, even in your brokenness. Not because God simply ignores it, but because God is always at work trying to bring healing and restoration. God's great intent for the world and for each one of us is that we should experience new life in Jesus Christ. And new life is not just a promise for eternity. New life is here and now. And that's exactly why Jesus came to those folk who were gathered in that room. Sometimes I think we don't realize the impact that God would have on this world through Jesus Christ. To be embraced by a love that won't let us go, by a love that is with us all the days of our lives, no matter what our particular momentary circumstances may be. The love of God is surrounding you right this moment and at work on your behalf. And when Jesus came to that upper room, that was a reality that the folk there needed to understand. But how do you comprehend this if you don't have an open mind? If you cannot begin to consider that which this world cannot deliver to you? This is the power of the gospel and the power of the good news of Jesus Christ. That God is always at work considering you and me. Always at work trying to restore us to the best possible life we can have while we are yet alive, and then inviting us into an eternal relationship. Open minds are more than willing to consider the possibility. And when we do that, Jesus becomes more real to us than ever before. Think about how he had to prove himself to those folk who were gathered in that room. He said, does a spirit, does a ghost have flesh and blood as you see me standing before you? No, a ghost is some kind of an ethereal thing that floats around in the air. But I'm here. I'm right here with you. And then, still doubting and still lacking real belief and an open mind, if you will, he said, do you have anything to eat? And they gave him a piece of fish. And he ate. Ghosts don't eat. Spirits don't consume food. And so once again, Jesus is trying to say, I am real. I have been raised. I am alive. And I am with you. Just as he was with those folk in that upper room, he is still with us. You know, he said to his disciples, you're going to miss me physically. I'm not going to be here physically. But I won't leave you without some presence, without some comfort. I will send a comforter to you. And you will know the reality of my resurrection because the Spirit will confirm it in your very hearts and souls. And that's what we celebrate when we gather. That the Spirit confirms in us the truth of the resurrection. And it's not just a confirmation for my sake or for your sake only. Because the mandate at that upper room moment was, you are my witnesses. This is a truth that you need to share with the world. Friends, when we look out at the world today, just the events of a single week can be overwhelming to us. We see the pain and the suffering of sin taking human life, disregarding the creation itself, destruction all around us. And in the midst of all of that, where do we find our hope? Where does it come from? If we give in to the despair that the world wants us to give into, it robs us of the zest and joy of life that God wants us to have. Jesus came to those folk in that room, and the Spirit comes to us to confirm within us that Christ is alive and Christ is with each of us. And yet, the world knew him not. And here we are, believers in this world. How do we witness to the truth of the resurrection? When Jesus said, "You are my witnesses," what was he saying to us? He was basically saying, don't lock yourself away. Don't simply huddle together and stay in this little group all the time, but move out into the world, because the world needs to hear the good news. And so we share the mandate that Jesus gave to those folk gathered in that room. "You are my witnesses," was said to each one of us, just as it was said to those folk in that room. What do we witness? How do we witness? We simply move out into the world as a people who not only speak the word, but share the word in deed. How we speak and relate to one another and how we relate out there in that world sows the seeds of the good news of Jesus Christ. So, we look carefully to our words. We look carefully to our actions. We just simply don't follow the crowd. Sometimes we have to step apart from the crowd and say what we have to say. I've shared this with you before, but one of the confirmations of my own journey as a Christian came when I was 17 years old. My dad was a truck driver. He was a rough talker. And I often had conflicts with him about that. And he would simply say to me, "If you don't like it, you don't have to live here." And I always said, if I became a parent, I would never say those words to my child, because they so distressed and hurt me at that time. But I also had friends who sometimes were very good talkers. And one night when we were walking together after dark, my friends started that kind of talk. And I said, "Would you please stop that? I don't care for it. We don't have to talk that way to talk with each other." And they said, "If you don't like it, you don't have to walk with us." And so I went home and went away. And I just simply walked by the little church that I had been attending. When I was 16, I didn't go to church at all. When I was 17, I was invited to become a part of a youth fellowship. And so I walked by this little church, and I knew in my heart at that moment that I had to pray about this. But I said, the door of this church will be locked. It always is. But for some reason, the Spirit took me to the door. I opened it and went in. I went to the little community room in that church, and I knelt in prayer. It still touches me, friends. I felt the presence of that Spirit about which Jesus spoke to his disciples. I was surrounded by such a sense of warmth and affirmation. I know that Christ lives. And my prayer for all of us is, as we continue our journeys in this world, that we too will know the truth of that. And that we will become those witnesses about which Jesus spoke when he said to those folk in that room, "You are my witnesses." Each of us is a witness to the good news. Christ is alive. And Christ is with us and within us. Share it with the world. Keep an open mind, friends, because in doing so, the Spirit of the living God will come to us and will give us a sense of our purpose and direction